I'm Jenny Radesky. I'm really excited to be here. I've loved Reach Out and Read since I was a trainee in Seattle and then at Boston Medical Center and now at Michigan. So I was really grateful and happy when Perry invited me to come talk today. So I'm an assistant professor of developmental behavioral pediatrics at the University of Michigan. I always want to tell people that I'm not financially involved with any of the people groups I may talk about during my talks, like Sesame Workshop, Common Sense Media. I just like to give some practical guidance for families, but I don't have any conflicts of interest. So today I'm going to talk about these new technologies, mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, how rapidly they've been emerging and adopted by the families that we treat, and dig in a little bit on my research on parent-child interaction and digital media, both with regard to parents using technologies as well as children's digital play and media use. And I like to think about media not all in a very negative frame, because we are, as Sarah was talking about, we have incredible brains that have created technologies that can really be used as fantastic tools. And so I always like to talk about the design features, the human-computer interaction part of the way children and adults play with technology is really important to think about in terms of moving forward, designing better technology for kids and parents, and thinking of media as a tool to support parent-child interactions rather than always as a distractor. So my clinical training as well as my research training has been very much embedded in infant mental health and early childhood relationships. And this, came about in my training in Seattle, working with a lot of child abuse cases, and then at Boston Medical Center, working with a lot of families who were, raising their children in a lot of adversity, and how this early parent-child relationship could buffer children against toxic stress and also help promote aspects of their social emotional development that are so important for school success and later mental health and health outcomes. But what I really wanted to do for my research was look at how digital media, specifically all these mobile devices that are now, occupying all of our interpersonal spaces, are interacting both with how the parent experiences their stress levels, experiences their world, and parents their child, and also how children are now interacting with media in very different ways compared to the other toys and objects, like books, that we've primarily relied on as teaching tools. So this is kind of the general framework with which I've approached my research. And as I was starting fellowship, I had done a year of primary care in Seattle, treating a lot of families who worked for Microsoft, and it was fascinating how all these mobile devices were suddenly in the exam room with us, and how kids were using them to stay calm, how parents were using to look up information as I was talking to them, and I just was like, this is fascinating. We need to study this and how these changes in technologies are affecting our interpersonal interactions. So this is a slide I created at the end of fellowship in 2014, when it was like, oh, look how rapidly all these new technologies are being, adopted by our families. And I really felt like these are different than just TV and videos, because they're portable and they're instantly accessible, and they have such a wide variety of applications and ways that they can be used by children and parents. So I felt like I needed to research this through a slightly different lens than just TV and videos, because of how different they are as technologies. Now, I've updated this slide to just show that this is currently towards the end of 2016, where we are for cell phone and smartphone adoption in US adults. And so you could see that cell phone usage is almost universal. Smartphone adoption is up into the 70s or 80s, but for young parents, it's up higher into the 80s and 90s. So it is a pretty universal device that we're all kind of experiencing our worlds through right now. And this is the evidence on tablet computers, the kind of green line, and e-readers have kind of plateaued. They're not as hip as they were in 2012, 2014, probably because some of the research that I'll talk about briefly. So you could see, however, that tablets, and as I have talked to people about, that when I'm in developmental behavioral pediatric clinic and my parent of a child with developmental delay says, Dr. Radesky, I'm getting them a tablet. We're going to do this. We're going to teach my kid. And I think there is this cultural feeling that tablets are inherently educational, and I worry that marketing message has become really embedded within families of young kids. And so you can see that tablet ownership continues to increase and become more prevalent. The data on how young kids are using technology, every time this is sampled every few years, it gets higher and higher and higher, and people get more and more anxious about it. Common Sense Media has done these nationwide surveys looking at how young kids are using technology. Back in 2011, only 10% of children under 2 years of age had ever used a mobile device, and that was up to 38% as of 2013. By 2015, when a study was done in a low-income clinic in Philadelphia, they surveyed parents of kids under age 4, and 97% of them had ever used a mobile device, and 3/4 of 4-year-olds owned their own device. So just this kind of rapid adoption has been something we've all been experiencing, I think, in our clinical work. And that parents spend, on average, 3 hours a day on their smartphones, although this varies a lot. If you've ever put an app tracker installed on your device, it's pretty fascinating to watch, to see how bad we are at estimating our own usage, because this is all based on parent report. And like I said, 84% of young parents own a smartphone. I love this slide because I think that it shows just how rapidly we are now adopting new technologies, and that when things like the color TV came out or the telephone came out, they really took years and years and years to become pretty saturated within our culture. Therefore, our culture had time to equilibrate and to reach like a new homeostasis, because every time a new technology is developed, it disrupts things. It makes us feel uncomfortable. The printing press disrupted oral histories. The telephone disrupted face-to-face interaction. But as you can see, the cell phone and internet have had a much steeper slope of adoption, and the time to reach 50 million global users has also kind of exponentially increased, so that when we were talking in the matter of decades for radio and TV, it went down to the matter of years for things like Facebook and iPhones, and then the matter of days to months for things like Google Plus and iPad. Now, I took this from the internet, so it could be fake news. So I don't have a resource for this, but it makes us all like, oh my gosh, a new app, millions of new apps seem to come out every month. Many of them are labeled as educational. What do we do about this with this high anxiety that people are experiencing about the way technologies are disrupting the way that we interact with our kids and the way that we teach our kids? So in response to that anxiety, one of my main feelings in writing the new American Academy of Pediatrics media guidelines for young kids was to say, okay, well, let's equilibrate. Let's start to use this as a tool. Let's start to use this to meet our human values and needs rather than feeling controlled by technology. But let's talk a little bit about how we're controlled by technology first. I'm going to talk a little bit about background TV. Now, this is the research that really influenced my research on mobile devices, because into the late 2000s, there were some really important studies showing that when a background TV is on, adults and children have fewer verbal exchanges. And then when you actually manipulate this in the lab, Heather Krikori and her colleagues found that compared to the 30 minutes when a TV is off, when the TV is on, that kids and their parents, these are preschoolers and parents, have fewer initiated interactions, but either the parents or the children. There's less sustained and complex play together, and there's a little less responsiveness, like, utterances are a little bit shorter. And then there have been a few follow-up studies suggesting that this may even contribute partially to language delay in young kids. This is still early evidence, but one recent study showed that background TV during mother-infant toy play was associated with a smaller child vocabulary at age 17 months. And this was mediated by lower maternal speech quality and quantity during play with the TV on in the background. And background TV is still really prevalent. This was a 2013 survey done by Ellen Wartella, and you can see that what I highlighted in red is the roughly third of U.S. families who report that the TV is on always or most of the time in their household. So it's a really, I think, modifiable barrier to these sorts of verbal interactions. Now, none of these have looked at some of like the social emotional sensitivity interactions that I've tried to then focus on in my subsequent research. And this is also just to highlight that some of these really media-centric families where the TV is on a lot of the time tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, minority race and ethnicity, and have lower parental education. So we don't know if this is really contributing to the word gap that we're seeing, but it's something that is potentially modifiable. So I was really inspired by some of these studies to start looking at whether these same dynamics exist with mobile devices. And we thought that this would be really hard to study because you can't pick up mobile device use on a Lena audio recorder like Dimitri Christakis had used. And you can't, if you're manipulated in a lab, what does that mean? You know, if you send a mom a text, you know, is that really how she's going to use it at home? So we decided to start with naturalistic observations, where we just went to a bunch of fast food restaurants in the Boston area to try to describe what was going on, describe the patterns of mobile device use by caregivers and their young children during meals. We hoped we would capture a lot of child tech use, and we didn't, I think because these were fast food meals like McDonald's and Chipotle and Panera. We wound up mostly focusing on parents. And so these were anonymous observations. We were just watching from a table about 5 to 10 feet away, taking field notes the way a non-participant anthropologist would, and we tried to get a really good sampling of all the different neighborhoods in the Boston area. Of our 55 families that we did these in-depth field notes as we observed them, 40 had or used a device. It might have been on the table, but for about 18 of them, which is a third of the sample, parents really just held it up to their face for a large portion of the time, either once they were done eating or kind of continuously throughout the meal. And we called these parents these highly absorbed parents who really were putting a lot of their engagement into the device, not into the interaction with the child. Now, fast food meals are not your ideal kind of time for emotional connection, but they're a really easily observable time to look at parent-child interaction that's pretty face-to-face. And we saw, again, this was qualitative analysis, very hypothesis generating, but time and again we saw less conversation during parent tech use, taking longer for the parent to respond, and more conflict. The parent raising their voice, shoving the child away, and children trying to escalate their behavior. Again, this was qualitative study, so we then wanted to use some videotaped interactions to actually code what was happening when a mobile device came out. And I was lucky enough to be able to quantify these associations by just using data that had already been collected. This was data from 225 mother-child dyads who were enrolled in this obesity study, the ABC feeding study at University of Michigan. And they had done this videotaped standard eating protocol. And it was boring. It was like 15 minutes of having all these different foods, and there was a lot of downtime, and 23% of moms spontaneously brought out their mobile device. So we got to then code whether they were using their mobile devices, and this was associated with significantly fewer verbal interactions, nonverbal interactions, and encouragements to their children about eating. And there was no associations with things like depression or parenting style that you think might be these huge confounders in the association between a parent using their mobile device and how they interact with their child. This just came out in child development. Myself and Brandon McDaniel, he had developed a scale called the Techno Ference scale, where parents answer questions about the frequency and types of devices interrupting the activities with their partner or child. These were couples, both reporting on the same child, and they were followed for 6 months. So this was just the baseline data, and what we found was that moms and dads who both reported more problematic use, like they feel a little bit addicted to their phones, were much more likely to have interference of the technology in their parent-child interactions during the day. And these were, only mother interference was associated with child externalizing and internalizing symptoms, as reported by mom and dad. So we think that might be that these were mostly stay-at-home moms who have a lot of activities with their children, and that's why it was more statistically significant. But this is the first to associate mobile device use with actual child behavior issues. I'll skip through this for the sake of time, but I really want to talk about, we had a lot of hypotheses about what was going on. Is this parents who are getting distracted? Are they just kind of, is this just becoming this new default thing that we do when we're bored and it's just displacing a lot of other parent-child activities? Is it just really overloading cognitively and that's why we can't interact with our kids when we're doing it? So I interviewed a bunch of families from Boston Medical Center and the surrounding communities to ask them what it felt like. And they said, I've never had this much information and all these people able to access me. And I have all the news of the world available at any moment. I have to then multitask between all these other demands and my child brain. And those are really different brains. They're very task-oriented versus very emotional. But I still have this fear of missing out. I need to keep up with work. There's all these new societal expectations that I be constantly connected. So parents are really feeling this too. It's not just us judging them for using technology, because I think we all know how that feels. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to focus a little bit on child digital play. Just to show that when it comes to digital toys, not even technology devices, this was a study last year in JAMA Pediatrics where during digital toy play, where the toy kind of makes beeps and whistles and stuff like that, there was less parent-child verbal exchange compared to traditional toys and books. And you can see that books are the square, and they always have higher adult words, child vocalizations, and really content-specific words that are really relevant to the child's attention, the ones that really help them learn words. So that was a great, audio recording how families play at home is also showing that digital enhancements are distracting. And these are really, they're programmed to be really engaging technologies, right? That this is called the attention economy, that they are designed to sell you things. They're designed to help you click on things. They're designed to maximize your engagement. This is what gamification is about. So it makes sense that these highly salient formal features like sound and visual effects distract from learning goals. When they do distract from learning goals, they decrease preschoolers' comprehension during ebook reading. So for example, if this is a story about, Andy and his buddy Woody, and the story is about Woody waving goodbye to him, if you're clicking on the hand and that's going along with the story, that doesn't really detract from comprehension. But if you're just clicking on Woody's nose, eyes, hat, the color blue, that is not relevant to the storyline, and then children wouldn't really understand what was going on in the story. What's important to know about the ebook studies is that when they're just boring ebooks, so you just turn the page and read them, there's not much difference between how children comprehend what they've read, or the new words that they've read, or the parent-child engagement. But all these studies haven't yet looked at the social, emotional, and affective characteristics of a reading interaction. And so that's what's really needed right now, is like what's happening with storytelling during these ebooks versus print books? What's happening with the kind of serve and return interactions? And I think that that's really kind of the next frontier of what we need. And I just also want to say that this is not, now all of our kids are walking around with their own video games under age 5, which they just hadn't done prior. And this idea that these devices are constantly trying to manage our attention and to do all this bottom-up control where they're just grabbing our orienting reflex, where we're like, oh, that's cool, I'm going to click that, I'm going to click that. That is not top-down control, where our brain is like thinking about a task and doing it start to finish. It's much more using our bottom brains. And the last thing I'll talk about, because I know I'm out of time, is just that we've started to look at how parents interact around traditional toys versus tablets. And these tablets are just, they're so much harder to scaffold around because the tablets are interactive. They're doing a lot more of the work. And the parents, I put this is not from our study, but you could see that children are just often just holding the thing in their hand, and parents are often like craning their necks and trying to cuddle in, and the posture differences during tablet play versus traditional play are so fascinating because they're just not kind of having the same sort of cuddling and reciprocity. And I think that that's another really important next step for the research. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to these slides about technology as a tool, but just to outline them. One is text-based interventions that give parents ideas. These have been shown to help, and that's what maybe we should be steering parents towards, using technology more as a tool for giving them ideas for child rearing. Spreading the message like we're trying to do with the AAP new media guidelines, that media should be a social activity, not something we're all doing in parallel on our own devices, and to use tools like stuff from PBS that is really designed to engage both the parent and the child together in a learning experience. And finally, using it as a tool for things like Skyping and social connection, rather than always thinking of it as an entertainment object. So thank you so much for letting me go over. I'm sorry. But I just wanted to also put up some of these suggestions for parents.